Colburn. I'm here with the Bike Walk Alliance of New Hampshire, but I'm probably an interloper or hopefully an integrator because, as Darren indicated, I don't bring a new health study or whatnot. What I do bring is greetings from my colleague and co-author Chris James, who's a lunatic cyclist in Tacoma, and Jim Lazar, who many of you may know and have worked with in Olympia, Washington, a longtime friend of the league. If Chris were here, he would have done a better job than I, because he rides about twice as much as I do in any given year. The Regulatory Assistance Project, you might be wondering, what is that? We work at the intersection of energy policy and environmental policy, advising public utility commissions and environmental regulators about how to bring more energy efficiency and renewable energy onto the grid. Okay, you still might be wondering, then what am I doing here? Well, in the course of that work, it occurred to us that as avid cyclists as well, there's a lot of overlap between the transport sector and the energy sector. You saw Portland's picture of the multiple lanes not being used. There's very short periods of time at peak, and the rest of the time those assets, those expensive and difficult to implement assets, are nearly unused, or at least largely unused. And there are better solutions. In the energy side, we call it efficiency. Here we'll call it bicycling. We'll call it demand side management, transport demand, whatever. In the energy side, we developed the thought that we have a little mantra at the Regulatory Assistance Project. It's energy efficiency is the answer. What was the question? Well, with that in mind, one of the things we did with efficiency, understanding that it is often not fully appreciated, was to build what we call a layer cake, trying to assemble all of, as Darren said, the arguments in one place. And typically with efficiency, what you get is recognition of the bottom, how much energy you didn't have to generate to use. And a lot of states just regard that as the answer, without respecting that you didn't need to have a transmission line deliver that power or distribution. You didn't have to have a power plant available in case that one goes down. And what about the water impacts? What about the air impacts? When you assemble all that stuff, instead of paying 5 or 10 or 15 cents a kilowatt hour, you're looking at about $2 of value for efficiency. Well, it occurred to us then, naturally, that we ought to build a layer cake for cycling as well. And I'll run through these quickly in the interest of time, but they'll all be on the web for you. When we came upon this was about the turn of the year, and at that time, Darren was preparing his masterwork, some of which he showed you, and Todd Littman his from Vancouver, and we drew heavily on those. Actually, I shouldn't say that about Darren. He's young. He probably still has his masterwork in. We'll wait for that, Darren. Thanks. The first is vehicle cost savings. I use the IRS numbers on that. Various people use other amounts, but the IRS is now 56.5 cents per mile. And I would note as we go through this, this is not per mile of infrastructure built. This is per mile ridden that we're talking about. Per mile not driving. You put that in toward the layer cake, then go to the second is user benefits. That's a lot of nice stuff that we've already talked about, but perhaps most importantly, property values. Darren mentioned this. One walk score point gets you between $1,000 and $3,000 in the resale of your property. A foot closer to the trail adds $7. And Darren mentioned the Indian and Delaware situations. So throw that in for another 25 cents a mile, and that's a low estimate. Building a layer cake. What about fitness and health? Lots on that too. New Zealand has some of the best numbers out there. They've done a lot of work on results, and they say it's $1.92. But some of our stuff, despite all these benefits, leads us to say something in the neighborhood of 20 cents a mile. Air and water pollution, I actually come out of the air pollution side, so while some of the data showed a 1 to 10 cent range, it didn't include global warming, it didn't include toxics, it didn't include particulates, all of which are the most health impactful, and it certainly didn't include exposure near highways. Don't live near a highway, especially multi-lane highway. And if you do, don't have your kids live.
You're not from New Jersey, are you?
I'm not. But I was the northernmost dot on Charles's graph from New Hampshire. I did go to New Jersey for the MS-150 City of the Shore, so I'm one of them in Charleston. Yeah, try not to. So I included that at 10 cents. What about option value and equity? These are two kind of esoteric concepts, but it's held by an example. You know, what's the value of having lifeboats even if you don't need them? Well, it's really helpful when you do need them. And then what about the people that aren't driving? What's their equitable share of the general fund money that you're spending now that your gas tax isn't covering all the highway infrastructure? So throw that in for 7 cents. What about reduced congestion? This is stress and travel time and aggravation. It's similar to peak load on the electric sector. And once again, small reductions make a big difference. Big range here too. I just tossed it in at 6 cents a mile, even though that's not representative of urban peaks, which can be as much as 6 times that. Land use impacts. This is, you know, reducing the sprawl, but the sprawl takes up the land and requires more highway lanes and requires more parking facilities as opposed to more compact development. And then there's the other community benefits and so forth. Again, the data out there is 5.3 cents. We all assume that's probably low. And even reduced parking itself. Right now, the data shows that there are 3 spaces for every vehicle. You know, there's one at the grocery store, there's one at the liquor store, there's one at the convenience store. Do we really need all of these spaces? That's all the more true in rural and suburban environments. So include that at 5 cents a mile, and that assumes a 20-mile trip, which probably isn't your average trip, more like 1 mile, so that would be $1 itself. So we're getting to be a pretty sizable layer cake ourselves here, but just reminding you of that, continuing on, roadway costs are a common one. It's almost surprising that it's this low in the stack, but that's $700 a person per year, and that sugars off at about 4 cents. Thanks, Darren. Crashes are one of the largest externalities associated with traffic. From 2 to 12 cents a vehicle that isn't in your vehicle cost and isn't in your fuel cost. We pay those separately. That's another 4 cents. Energy conservation. Each mode shift, 1% shifts our fuel use 2 to 4%. Imagine what we can do. And yet that's only 3% on the stack. And then reduce barriers. You know, this is a lot of different stuff, but think of the most common example we all know of. They build a new school and don't put sidewalks to it. We've all been there. How dumb is that? And that's only in for a penny. And then we get this kind of esoteric stuff, and there's 5 associated with economic development, and they're difficult to quantify. You know, economic development isn't something you can really do, it's something you have to seed. So they are difficult to quantify, and I've just put in placeholders for a penny. But transport efficiency is one of those, reducing the costs to everybody to get to where they need to go, and that increases productivity. You know, when we look at the current federal transportation alternatives budget, that's $809 million. Building the lanes you've already heard about costs $40 to $80 million. So we can build 10 to 20 miles of 4-lane highway for the federal allocation for transportation alternatives. How efficient is that? AKA, how dumb is that? Look at it another way. Here's an expensive city to live in, Chicago, at about a third of people's income it costs to live there. But wait, Cincinnati's only a quarter, but because you need a car to get where you want to go, they both shake out at the same cost of living to live and get to work.
You can get around on a bottom bike.
Getting working. And likewise, when you look at 2 cities that have the same amount for their housing costs, the transportation cost makes all the difference. So this expensive city, Boston, is actually less expensive to live in than Tampa. And these are just 2 examples. This is out of a study done a year ago by the Center for Neighborhood Technology. Labor productivity is another one. This is one of my favorites. It happens in a lot of respects, but the one I like to cite is the International Police Mountain Biking Association did some data on this, and arrests rose 24%. Why? because it's way easier to sneak up on somebody when you're not in a cruiser. And likewise, parking, the same story, because the police didn't have to screw around searching for a parking place themselves. So, labor productivity. Land use efficiency is a close relative to the others. Consumer spending, we talked a lot about that with the other panelists. Let me just indicate an example that economic activity for the fuel side and autos as well, especially in the manufacturer, much of it's imported and much of it's capital intense. Those things don't resonate well with jobs. So economic activity increases as spending goes elsewhere. New Hampshire is a good example. My home state, we send $7 billion a year out of state for energy, most of it for petroleum. I'm sorry, we spend $7 billion. 2/3 of that leaves the state instantly. And then there's specific industries we've talked about, bike shops and tourism and retail. Also construction and real estate development. What? Construction? Real estate? Yep. It turns out that the top reason for mortgage disapproval, car payments are too high. And so what the corollary of that is that the percentage of the probability of mortgage foreclosure increases with car ownership. There's a story there. So we end up with this quite sizable stack in the end. The total of that with all these lowball numbers is $1.52 for every mile ridden. It's conservative. Todd Littman's numbers at peak, urban peak and urban off-peak are 3 to 5 times that. And what I'm hoping is that you use this framework to build your own layer cake. Be careful with things like double counting. There are some overlaps. Be careful with who pays. This is a societal thing. This doesn't all accrue to your pocket. But difficult to quantify certainly doesn't mean unimportant. We talked about the jobs thing. Darren already covered that. The criticality there is capital versus labor. If you want jobs, go with labor. What we're doing does not do that. And then the last slide, bring it back to energy. What we've seen in energy is renewable portfolio standards and energy efficiency resource standards. There are states now with 20 to 30% of their energy going to be required from renewable sources. Think of that in transportation. We're already seeing it. We're seeing gross domestic product being decoupled from VMT, vehicle miles traveled, over the last 10 years. It's off about 15% now. That leaves the question for you on the Hill, for your members of Congress. This is happening. It's not going to happen, it's happening. Are you going to lead, follow, or are you just going to get run over? So I'll leave you with a little different question. Bicycling's the answer. What was the question?